They say some toys are harmless, but what if they're not? 3 dollhouses. 3 families trapped. 3 stories where reality itself twists, mirrors, and refuses to let go. In one, a dollhouse moves on its own, copying every detail of a young man's apartment, until the dolls start to mimic him. In another, a miniature house waits patiently, collecting the life of anyone who dares to bring it home. And in the last, a shadowy figure hides in the halls of a dollhouse, waiting for its next owner, while the tiny family inside grows eerily alive. These aren't just stories, they're warnings. Do you dare to look closer? Because once you do, it might be too late. Story Part 1. I realized something was wrong the moment the doll in the tiny living room turned its head and looked directly at me, because I hadn't touched the dollhouse in over 10 years, and the room it showed was the one I was standing in right now. The dollhouse arrived at my childhood home the same day my grandmother died. No note, no return address, just a wooden box left on the porch, damp with rain despite the clear sky. My mother assumed it was one of my grandmother's old things finally being sent back from storage, but even as a child, I felt a wrongness clinging to it, like a smell you can't place but no means rot. The dollhouse was heavy, crafted from dark wood, carved with delicate patterns that looked too detailed for human hands. Every window had real glass. Every door opened with a tiny brass handle. Inside were rooms furnished down to microscopic details. Plates with food frozen in mid-meal. Framed photographs smaller than my fingernail. Beds with neatly folded blankets. And then there were the dolls. They weren't cute. They weren't friendly. Their faces were sculpted with unsettling realism. Wrinkles, tiny veins beneath translucent skin, eyes that reflected light too accurately. There were 5 of them, a family, a man, a woman, a boy, a girl, and an extra figure, placed in the upstairs hallway, standing motionless, its features intentionally vague, almost unfinished. My grandmother had been obsessed with miniatures. She used to say that small things remembered more than big ones, that they watched quietly while humans rushed past. I wasn't allowed to touch the dollhouse. My mother locked it in the spare room and told me to forget about it. I tried, for years. But sometimes, late at night, I could hear movement. Soft clicking, like fingernails on wood, coming from behind the locked door. When my parents divorced and we moved away, the dollhouse stayed behind. The house was sold. Life moved on. I grew up, went to college, built a normal life. I forgot the tiny faces staring through miniature windows. Until my mother died. Cleaning out her belongings was exhausting in a numb, mechanical way. Old letters. Clothing that still smelled like her perfume. Then, in a dusty corner of a storage unit she'd rented years ago, I found a familiar wooden box. The dollhouse was inside, perfectly intact, untouched by time. I should have left it there. I know that now. But grief makes you nostalgic, and nostalgia makes you stupid. I brought it home. I live alone in a small apartment, 1 bedroom, living room, narrow hallway. The dollhouse fit perfectly on a shelf opposite my couch. Too perfectly, actually. The scale felt off somehow, like it had been designed for that exact space. I told myself it was just a childhood artifact, that the discomfort was memory, not intuition. That night, I dreamed of my grandmother sitting at a table too small for her fingers impossibly large as she arranged dolls. "They don't like being ignored," she whispered, without looking at me. I awoke with my heart racing and my eyes fixed on the dollhouse. The living room inside it matched mine. Same couch, same lamp, same throw pillow with the tear in the corner I kept meaning to sew. I laughed, a real laugh, nervous but real. Of course it matched. I was projecting. The human brain looks for patterns. Then I noticed the doll on the couch. Its posture was exactly mine. I didn't sleep after that. The next day, I moved the dollhouse into my bedroom closet and shut the door. Out of sight, out of mind. I went to work. I distracted myself. I avoided thinking about it. When I came home, my closet door was open. The dollhouse was back on the shelf. This time, the dolls were positioned differently. The family stood together in the living room, facing the front wall, as if watching something unseen. The unfinished doll was closer to the foreground now, its blank face tilted upward. A chill crawled over my skin. I closed my eyes, counted to 5, opened them again. Nothing changed. That night, things escalated. I woke to the sound of something falling. A soft thud, followed by a faint, almost imperceptible laugh. In the dim light, I saw a tiny chair from the dollhouse, lying on the floor beneath the shelf. I didn't touch it. I backed away, my breath shallow, my brain screaming explanations that didn't hold together. The next morning, I called in sick and sat on my couch, watching the dollhouse like it might explode. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Stop moving things. I stared at the screen, numb. My fingers shook as I typed back. Who is this? A reply came instantly. We see better when YOURE still. Something in me snapped. I grabbed the dollhouse and shoved it into a trash bag. I didn't bother wrapping it carefully. I just wanted it gone. I drove across town to a landfill and threw it into a dumpster, not even looking back. Relief washed over me. Immediate, intoxicating. That night, I slept like the dead. Until I felt hands on my face. Tiny, cold, pressing against my cheeks, my lips, my eyes. I screamed and bolted upright. The dollhouse was on my nightstand, closer than it had ever been. Inside it, the bedroom was now perfectly replicated. Every detail, the rumpled bedsheets, the crack in the ceiling, the scar on the pillowcase where I'd burned it with a cigarette years ago. The unfinished doll stood at the foot of the miniature bed, and it had my face. I don't remember screaming again, but my throat burned, so I must have. I smashed the dollhouse against the wall. Wood cracked, glass shattered, dolls flew apart, limbs snapping. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I felt pain, sharp, sudden, everywhere. My arm bent at an impossible angle. Blood pooled on the floor where my ankle twisted wrong. Tiny cuts opened across my skin in the same places the dollhouse lay broken. I understood then. Damage translated. I crawled away, sobbing, leaving a trail of blood, while the shattered dollhouse slowly began to reassemble itself. Wood knitting back together, glass smoothing over, dolls rising, snapping into place with delicate precision. The unfinished doll watched me. It lifted one tiny hand, and I felt my fingers twitch in response. Days passed. I stopped trying to escape. Every attempt ended with pain, or worse, bruises appearing without being touched, objects moving only when I moved, my reflection lagging behind by a fraction of a second. I studied the dollhouse obsessively, learning its rules the way prisoners learn the habits of guards. The dolls didn't move unless I wasn't watching. They didn't like sudden changes. And the unfinished doll, it followed me, always mirrored one step behind. I found old journals among my grandmother's things, buried near the bottom of a box, brittle with age. She wrote about the house, about how it needed a caretaker, about how the dolls were anchors, representations of real people bound to the structure, about how the unfinished one was always waiting. Every generation, she wrote, one must stay. The house does not let itself be forgotten. I was never meant to own it. I was meant to replace her. The final entry was short. It mirrors truth. When the truth is accepted, the transfer is painless. I laughed when I read that, a hysterical, broken sound, because I knew exactly what accepting meant. That night, I sat in front of the dollhouse and spoke to it softly, like you would to a frightened animal. I understand, I said. I won't fight. The unfinished doll smiled. Pain blossomed through my chest, deep and crushing, then faded into numbness. When I opened my eyes, I was very small. The world towered over me, distorted through thick glass windows. Across from me stood a massive bedroom, impossibly large, where a woman lay still on a bed, her eyes open but empty. A new doll stood in the hallway now, an unfinished one. On a shelf in a quiet apartment, a perfectly ordinary dollhouse sits untouched. If you look closely, you'll notice the dolls sometimes change positions. And if you ever feel like something small is watching you from the corner of the room, it probably is. Just don't move too much. They see better when you're still. Story Part 2. The first time I saw the dollhouse, It was in the window of an estate sale. It was old, dusty, and coated in a thick layer of varnish that made it gleam in the afternoon sun. I was drawn to it immediately. There was something hypnotic about it. The way the tiny windows caught the light, the way the doors seemed just slightly too real. The sign said estate sale. Everything must go, so I went inside, ignoring the warning in my gut. The woman running the sale was tiny, frail, with pale blue eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "That one," she said, pointing at the dollhouse. "Be careful, some things don't belong in the real world." She smiled, but wasn't warm. It was the smile of someone who has seen something no one should ever see. I didn't listen. I bought it. I carried it home, feeling the weight of it in my arms, and set it on the living room table. It was perfect in every way. The craftsmanship was impeccable. Tiny wooden beams, a fully furnished interior, and 5 little dolls placed neatly inside. There was a father, a mother, a boy, a girl, and a small figure that looked like a housekeeper, or maybe a shadow. I didn't think much of it at the time. That night, I was woken by scratching sounds, soft, almost delicate, like fingernails against wood. I told myself it was just the house settling. I had brought a lot of junk home from the sale. Maybe one of the shelves had shifted, but the scratching grew louder, more deliberate. And then I noticed something. The dolls weren't in the same position I'd left them in. The father doll, which had been sitting in a tiny armchair, now stood in the doorway. The boy had turned to face the hallway. The shadowy figure was closer to the front door. I laughed nervously, telling myself I must have moved them without realizing it. But the more I tried to convince myself, the colder the room felt, and the more I noticed the details I had missed. The scratches on the floor of the dollhouse, the tiny fingerprints on the windows. The next day, I left for work, trying to ignore the house. When I returned, the dollhouse had moved, and a lot, but enough that I had to step aside to avoid knocking it over. And the dolls, they had all shifted. They were now facing toward the living room window, and I could swear I felt eyes on me. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear whispers, faint, fragmented sentences and voices that weren't mine. "Do you see? Do you know? She isn't gone." I tried leaving the dollhouse in storage, but every morning it was back on the table, exactly where it had been. No amount of tape, boxes, or locked closets could keep it away. Then I noticed the reflection. One morning, I poured coffee in the kitchen and saw the dollhouse reflected in the window. But the reflection wasn't right. The dolls were out of position again, but this time, they were mimicking my own posture. My arm lifted, and the tiny father doll lifted his arm. My head turned, and the boy doll's head turned too. My heart skipped a beat. Panic set in. I tried smashing the dollhouse, burning it, throwing it into the river. None of it worked. It always returned. And with each return, it became more alive. The dolls moved faster, sometimes when I was watching. Sometimes I could swear I heard them breathe. One night, I awoke to see the shadowy figure standing at the edge of my bed. Its face was featureless, but its tiny hands reached toward me. My entire body froze. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then I realized the dolls were on the table, watching me. But they weren't watching me in the usual sense. They were mirroring me. Every twitch, every blink, every shallow breath I took, the dolls copied perfectly. Terrified, the first tried reasoning with it. I spoke softly, telling myself it was just a toy. But it wasn't. It had me under its control. I couldn't leave the room, couldn't look away. Even small movements felt dangerous. I realized then, the dolls were learning, watching. They were waiting. Days blurred into nights. I began to lose track of my own reflection. In mirrors, I sometimes saw a doll-like version of myself staring back. My friends stopped visiting. I stopped leaving the apartment. Food appeared on the counter, untouched. Water ran in the sink for hours. And always, the dollhouse sat there, pristine, unmoving, or at least it seemed so. Then I noticed something truly horrifying. The dolls were changing. Slowly, over the course of weeks, their tiny faces began to resemble people I knew, or thought I knew. My best friend, my neighbor, my ex-girlfriend, even my own father. Every time I looked closer, they stared back at me with a horrifyingly accurate intensity. Finally, I found the old receipt from the estate sale in a drawer. The woman's handwriting was on it. Keep it safe. It chooses its owner. One day, it will want more than observation. I had ignored it. I had thought she was crazy. That night, I heard the whispers again, louder this time. "Join us." I turned to see all 5 dolls standing on the floor. The shadowy one was taller now, faceless, but unmistakably moving toward me. And then I realized they weren't just mirroring me anymore. They were ready to replace me. I ran to the table, but my movements were sluggish. The dolls mimicked each struggle. I tried to smash them, but my hands passed through them as if they were made of smoke. And then, in a flash, I felt myself shrinking, my body compressing, limbs folding in ways they shouldn't. I looked down. I was now inside the dollhouse. Looking out, everything was enormous. The living room, the window, the ceiling, it was all huge. And on the couch, staring at me, was a tiny version of myself, a doll, perfectly posed, faceless, but unmistakably me. From outside, the apartment looked empty. Friends passing by the window saw nothing but an untouched dollhouse on the table. But I knew the truth. Every movement I made was mirrored. Every breath I took was cataloged. And the shadowy figure? It was now standing at the edge of the dollhouse, reaching out, waiting for the next owner. Somewhere, in the real world, my body still exists. But my consciousness is trapped. A tiny screaming thing inside a tiny world that mirrors reality. And the dollhouse. The dollhouse waits for the next person to see it in a window, drawn in by the hypnotic perfection of its tiny, living world. Story Part 3. I didn't believe in haunted objects. That is, until the night I found the dollhouse in the attic. It belonged to the previous owner of the house, a woman who had died under mysterious circumstances. The real estate agent had mentioned it in passing, like it was nothing more than a curiosity. "It's very old," she said, her voice tight. "Just keep it in the corner and don't open it if you can help it." I laughed. I thought she was joking. The dollhouse was beautiful. Gothic architecture, tiny stained glass windows, delicate iron railings. Inside were miniature rooms, furnished with uncanny precision. A tiny dining table set with plates of food frozen in time. Miniature books on a bookshelf. A little grandfather clock that ticked even though the dollhouse wasn't plugged in. And there were the dolls, a family of 4, and a 5th figure that looked unfinished, a shadow of a person. I set it on a shelf in my bedroom, thinking it would be a conversation piece. That night, I woke to the sound of whispers, low, urgent murmurs, too soft to make out. I chalked it up to my imagination. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The dolls had moved. Not much, just subtle shifts in posture. The mother had turned slightly toward the staircase. The boy was no longer sitting at the tiny desk, but standing near the window. I convinced myself it was gravity, or maybe I had nudged them in my sleep. But over the next few days, it became impossible to ignore. The dollhouse mirrored the real world. If I moved a chair in my room, a tiny replica moved in the dollhouse. If I sat in my bed, the little father doll would sit in the same position. It was horrifying. I tried ignoring it. I even locked the dollhouse in my closet. But at night, I could hear soft tapping, and in the morning, the dollhouse would be back on the shelf. Every detail of my life began appearing in its rooms. The window curtains I had just bought, the stack of magazines on my coffee table, even the crack in my bedroom ceiling. Then the dolls began to act on their own. The unfinished figures started moving first, pacing back and forth. The others followed, arranging themselves in ways I hadn't left them. Sometimes I swore they looked at me directly, eyes glinting like glass. I started sleeping in the living room, lights on, doors locked. But the dolls' movements became more aggressive. When I left the house, I would return to find the miniature kitchen overturned, tiny chairs broken, the unfinished figure standing in the hallway as if waiting. One night, I woke to a strange sensation. I felt as though I was shrinking. My hands felt small, my legs weak. I looked down and realized I was now at eye level with the dollhouse. From the top of the shelf, the room looked impossibly large, and inside the dollhouse, the figures were me, my posture, my clothes, even my face. I tried to scream, but only a faint, high-pitched whimper came out. The unfinished figure moved closer, and I realized the terrifying truth. The dollhouse wasn't just mimicking reality. It was replacing it. Days passed in a blur. I couldn't move, couldn't leave the apartment. My reflection in the mirror no longer matched me. It was a miniature, trapped version, staring back with wide, unblinking eyes. Food appeared untouched. Phone calls went unanswered. Every attempt to escape ended with me waking up back in my room, the dollhouse on the shelf, the dolls perfectly positioned, and the shadowy figure waiting. I researched the house's history. The previous owner had kept journals. She wrote of a mirror house, a cursed miniature that absorbed its owner's life, their essence, until they became part of it. The unfinished doll was the collector, waiting for the next soul. I understood then. It didn't want me to leave. It wanted me inside, a permanent fixture, mirrored for eternity. I don't know how long I've been like this now. Hours, days, maybe weeks. The world outside is massive, incomprehensible. And the unfinished doll? It watches from the edge, silent, patient, waiting for the next person to bring the dollhouse into their life. If you ever see a dollhouse that seems too detailed, with dolls that stare just a little too long, don't take it home. Don't even touch it. Because if it wants you, it will find a way. The end.